Right, let's talk about nerves. And as we do, we're going to answer a couple questions like, what is the difference between a neuron and a nerve? And what are the components of a spinal nerve? So to start out, I want to cover a couple terms like neuron, nerve fiber, and nerve. Neurons consist of a cell body, an axon, and then either dendrites or receptor terminals depending on the type of neuron. Then a nerve fiber is a neuron with its neurolemma or glial cells and the surrounding endoneurial tissue. And if we look at this complete anatomy image here, we can see the axon of the neuron there, its glial cell providing myelin, as well as this endoneurial tissue surrounding. Then finally, a nerve is a bundle of these nerve fibers that are all wrapped together in epineurium. And there are two main types of nerves that we're going to be talking about quite a bit in this course. And one type are spinal nerves and the other are cranial nerves. So what are the differences between those two types of nerves? For spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs of nerves that come off of the spinal cord, and each of those nerves are going to exit the vertebral column through intervertebral foramen. And I have one of those highlighted there in purple. Then for cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs of nerves that come off of the brain and the brainstem, and those are going to exit through the cranial foramen. For the rest of this video, we're mainly going to focus on spinal nerves and their structure. And what we're going to learn is that spinal nerves are like trees. So let's do some arbor anatomy. So if we look at this picture of a tree here, we see that there are roots, and then there's a trunk, and then there's all these different branches going everywhere. So now we're going to flip that tree over and we're going to add a spinal cord segment with its spinal nerve. And just like the tree anatomy, we see that the spinal nerve has roots, then a spinal nerve trunk, and then branches. But instead of calling them branches, we're going to call them rami, which just means branches. So let's look a little bit closer at each of these different components of a spinal nerve and see what they do. We'll start with the dorsal root, which we have highlighted in purple. And the main thing to know about the dorsal root is that it is the sensory root. Those pseudo-unipolar neurons that we learned about earlier come through the dorsal root, and that swelling that you can see there is called the dorsal root ganglion. And that is where the pseudo-unipolar neurons have their cell bodies. So if the dorsal root is injured, the sensory at that spinal cord level would be affected, but the motor coming from that level would not be affected at all. And that is because the motor innervation is coming from the ventral root, which we now see highlighted in purple. And so if the ventral root was injured, that person would have difficulty performing the actions for the myotome of that spinal cord level, but they would not have any issues with any sensory. So the ventral root only carries efferent motor fibers that are exiting the spinal cord, while the dorsal root only carries afferent sensory fibers that are arriving at the spinal cord. And as we now move out to the spinal nerve trunk, we'll see that that now carries both motor and sensory fibers. So there's fibers that are efferent as well as fibers that are afferent. And pretty quickly, we can see that the spinal nerve trunk splits into a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. And so looking at the dorsal ramus, that is going to do motor innervation to the epaxial or the true back muscles, as well as sensory innervation to the medial back. And then the ventral ramus is going to do motor innervation for hypaxial muscles that develop from the hypomere. And it will also do sensory innervation to the limbs, the ventral torso, and then like the lateral part of the back as well. And I think one of the best ways to learn all these components is to see them in action. So we're going to throw it back to your undergrad Gen Chem labs, and we've got a little scenario here. And it is that you touch a hot beaker with your right hand, and then just instinctively you immediately pull your hand back. So let's trace this nerve pathway, and to do this we're going to use this image of a spinal cord segment, and then we're going to have afferent or sensory input from the right hand, so we'll add an image of that there, and then we're going to have those efferent motor fibers going to the right biceps brachii to help us pull our hand away from the hot beaker. So we'll use light blue to represent the somatic sensory neuron, and as we follow it, we'll see it goes through the ventral ramus, and then through the spinal nerve trunk. And since it's a sensory neuron, it's always going to go through the dorsal root. And it's a pseudo-unipolar neuron, so it has its cell body there in the dorsal root ganglion. And then we can see it will synapse with a pink interneuron in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. And that pink interneuron is going to come ventrally and synapse with a somatic motor neuron here in red. And that somatic motor neuron is then going to exit out the ventral root through the spinal nerve trunk. And then since we're going to a limb, we're going to go through the ventral ramus to eventually get to the right biceps brachii to then be able to pull our hand back. And that is our video on nerves, so let's do a quick recap. We learned the difference between neurons and nerves, and that nerves are just groups of neurons with their glial cells that are all wrapped together in epineurium. We also learned spinal nerve structure, and that there is a dorsal root that is just for sensory, and a ventral root that is just for motor. And then those come together to make the spinal nerve trunk, and that's going to have both sensory and motor information. And then the spinal nerve trunk eventually splits into two rami, a dorsal ramus that does sensory and motor to the epaxial back muscles, and then a ventral ramus that does sensory as well as motor innervation to hypaxial muscles like limbs and the trunk and torso. And that is it for our recap on nerves.